A very warm welcome to Radio Islam International, where today we have our special guest Azad Essa on the launch of his book called Hostile Homelands. And just a bit about our guest, he's a journalist and author based in New York and currently a senior reporter for the Middle East Eye, covering American foreign policy, Islamophobia and race in the United States of America. Azad, a great welcome to you and congratulations on the publication of your book. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Radio Islam.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
Just a bit about the book that we're going to be talking about this evening, Hostile Homelands. It's a book that puts India's relationship with India in its historical context, looking at the origins of Zionism and Hindutva, as well as India's changing position on Palestine and the country's growing military-industrial relationship from the 1990s. And in the book, Issa demonstrates that India-Israel alliance spells significant consequences for democracy, the rule of law, and justice worldwide. I want to start on a bit of a personal note. Azad, we look at your work with Middle East Eye, the type of topics that you are covering. In South Africa previously, you spoke about Jacob Zuma, you spoke about the politics of that particular era, as well as the Muslim community in South Africa, or growing up as a Muslim in South Africa, previously with Al Jazeera, looking at politics, looking at development and poverty, the actions of UN peacekeepers previously, and many other stories that you've covered, and now looking at the alliance between India and Israel. So would you say that this is evolving interests as a journalist and in your own personal journey of discovery, or there is a common strain or a common link between everything that you've done so far?
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for hosting me today. I think there's two elements to it, precisely what you were saying. The first one is that it's kind of like an evolution of interest, but also connecting the thread between these different interests as well. So, for instance, you mentioned that I've been writing about the UN peacekeepers. When I reported for Al Jazeera, I traveled to several African countries to report on development, politics, humanitarian disasters. And one of the things that I noticed alongside the reporting that I had to do for Al Jazeera was this kind of movement from foreign nations like China, the UAE, Turkey, India, Israel, when it comes to investing on the continent. So I started noticing a lot more of that happening, and I started watching how these investments were kind of playing a role in the ways in which those African countries were being kind of engaging with those foreign entities, right? So we know China's entry onto the African continent has been well documented. A lot of it is extremely biased against the Chinese. And of course, there are serial and real concerns about how they operate on the continent. But there are other players under the shadows of this big monster called China that's on the continent. So I think the connection between India and Israel for me also comes from my background as a South African as well. And I think that comes through in the book and comes through in my previous writings as well. In that, as someone growing up in South Africa, I was deeply enamored by India and India's role in the anti-apartheid movement. And so when I started realizing a lot more about the story of Indian independence and what it meant for a place like Kashmir, it made me rethink the kinds of ideas that I had associated with India. And so that change, accompanied me in all of my work, my journalism work, throughout, even if I wasn't writing about India at the time. But that kind of cynicism and that kind of skepticism about how countries present themselves and what they might be in real terms, shaped the way I looked at things. And of course, Palestine is one of the stories of our time, right? One of the biggest issues of our time. and to see how a country like India has now become part of the occupation of the Palestinians, and to see how so many media organizations and activists seem to not see that connection, meant that I felt like perfectly placed as someone who's been tracing this Indian story to make that connection.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think the subtitle of your book, The New Alliance Between India and Israel, is quite self-explanatory. Perhaps what needs a bit more explanation for a person who'd pick up a copy of the book is the actual title, Hostile Homelands. If you could perhaps just explain the significance of that.
So the title of the book came from the publishers after they read the manuscript. So it's not my title, but I deeply appreciate the title and deeply acknowledge their role in tying up what the manuscript was trying to say and providing this fitting title. Now, when you think about the main title there, and that is Homelands, both Israel and India have tried to present themselves as a kind of homeland for a certain type of person or a certain type of people, or you could say a nation. So, and this ties directly with regards to like Zionism, which, positions itself as this ideology that is meant to create a homeland for the Jewish people. And now, similarly, India, through Hindutva, through the Hindu Nationalist Project, has also positioned this idea of creating a homeland for Hindus. And both these homelands, they're not homelands for anyone. They're homelands for a specific, let's say, for lack of a better word, tribe of person, and a specific a specific ethnicity, right, and or specific religious identity, and both of them are extremely exclusionary. So if you're not part of that nation, then that homeland is not for you. So it's not your homeland. So the story, the story for people who are interested in the book is about trying to explain how these two countries, have on one hand spoken about creating a homeland, which is such a potentially noble idea, but at the same time creating a homeland just for certain kinds of people, and how that has essentially, built up their relationship between each other, and how they have used each other's tactics, specifically and more particularly India using Israeli tactics, but not exclusively so, right, to create that exclusionary space, a hostile space for people. And it goes directly to the heart of it, which is what Hindutva and Zionism is about, which is these are exclusionary homelands. Now, also the thing with the book is, as someone else pointed out earlier today, was the colors of the flag, of the old apartheid South Africa flag. And that means that the idea is to showcase that there are people who are never going to fit into this apartheid system as well.
When I read through the book, Azad, I find that there is so many parallels between the two cases, between Hindutva and Zionism, between Israel and India today. It's almost as if whatever you have in Zionism, whatever you have in Haspara, you've got Hindutva counterpart to that. Now, obviously, between different systems of oppression around the world, one would always find these common threads. But do you get the feeling that there's just such an overwhelming number of comparisons between these two cases that kind of elevates it to a special case, even more than other similar systems of oppression around the world?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. All nationalisms have some type of insider-outsider element to it, right? There's an inclusionary character and there's an exclusionary character to nationalism. We see it all around the world. So we can say that with a matter of certainty that, many nations around the world have these issues in which certain people will belong more than others. When it comes to India and Israel, the difference to a large extent is the connection with religion and kind of the instrumentalization of either Judaism or Hinduism into creating an idea that you can't fit into those into these homelands or into these nations if you do not fit as part of that religious identity, right? Then the second thing is how they both instrumentalize even concept of democracy, right? So for them, they have a kind of like pseudo democracy in which only certain people can will end up voting. So in Israel, it's pretty clear that if you're a Palestinian and you're not a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and you're part of the West Bank of Gaza, you have no rights at all. Right? There's no political rights. And if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you have lesser rights than a Jew in Israel. Now in India, everyone theoretically can also vote, right? But there's a problem in which there are so many ways in which you exclude people from voting. And secondly, there's Kashmiris who don't really want to be voting anyway, and they're not, they're not part of the system in any case, right? So the democracy also doesn't make sense for a certain and a significant section of the society as well, right? So the democracy is flawed, but they use democracy to justify the security policies, to justify the way they interact with their society, to justify the laws that they create, and also justify the security mechanism. And it's often tied back again to the Hindu nationalist imagination and to the Zionist imagination. Then the other aspect to it is the same part about weaponizing kind of anti-Semitism, meaning attacks on Jews, which has been, for several hundreds of years, a real thing, right? It still continues in many places today, in which there are legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism, but then they tie it up directly with critique of Israel. So they conflate the two. And India has been doing the same now, in which you talk about India in critical terms, then you're going to be called a Hindu-phobe. So those are just like three particular types of similarities. But there's also a deeper similarity, and that also it goes back to the sort of imagination of both countries and both nations being these ancient civilizations, right? So they use this mythology. Both use immense mythology. All nationalisms use some type of mythology. But these guys they go to the next level with the mythology. And they link it to like religious text, right? To justify. And they both believe that they have come from these ancient fountains of knowledge, and both have been corrupted or contaminated, so-called, by outsiders. And now they need to return to that pure nation so that they can be the best versions of themselves. And as part of that, they have an extraterritorial vision, which means that they can justify, moving and expanding as far as they want. Israel can move into Lebanon, Syria, anywhere in the Middle East because they don't have a border. And India also has this Akhand Bharat, which is undivided India, in which the imagination is that the entire South Asia is actually India.
So while they have these common traits between them, how much does the other, in this case the Muslim, be a uniting force for these two ideologies? Is it just about self-expansion as well as this ethnic purity of themselves, or are they defined as well very heavily to the extent of their hatred towards Muslims?
So Islamophobia is in many ways the glue that binds these two ideologies. And this goes back more than 100 years. It's tied to European Orientalism in the Middle East. It's tied to European Orientalism in Asia, in South Asia as well, of which both Zionism and Hindutva have essentially taken on, right? And so one of the connections between Hindutva and their fascination with Zionism is that they're felt sort of enamored by how Zionists essentially have dealt with Muslims or dealt with the Palestinian, right? Of course, Palestinians are not just Muslims, but in large part, there's many Muslims, and so this idea that the Zionist ideology has been able to, kind of tame Muslims is what Hindutva also tries to copy and replicate. And also you got to think about the kind of language that they use. Both see Muslims as kind of savage, backward, intellectually sort of like inferior, kind of, and they're able to kind of poke, or not poke, but rather they're able to add on other elements of racism and Islamophobia coming from the West, that positions like Muslim men as being like very misogynistic and patriarchal, and so they are able to create a kind of civilizational argument in which Zionism and Hindutva are kind of superior culture to Islam or to Muslims, and that if they had to succeed with their project, that these places would become more civilized, and these places would become more free, and these places would become more, amenable for women. So absolutely, that connection is deeply connected, and also in many ways the project of Zionism, the project of Israel, the Jewish state, as envisaged by the British colonial powers at the time, was to have this Jewish state as a kind of bulwark against the East, against Muslims, and so it was imagined in that way, from the beginning.
Indeed. If you've just joined us, we are speaking to Azad Essa. He is in South Africa for the launch of his new book called Hostile Homelands, the new alliance between India and Israel. Some of the major topics that are covered in this book, and this just gives you a good high-level account of what the book is all about. The story of the two partitions, the partition in Palestine, the partition in the Indian subcontinent, the military-industrial complex, and that's the immense role that Israel is playing in supplying India with weapons, Hindutva and Zionism, and obviously this is the links or the parallels, similarities on an ideological level between these two concepts. The Indian diaspora and the Israeli lobby in the United States. So just as you have a lobby for Zionism, how there are very effective Hindutva lobbies now operating in the West. And the book ends up with the story of two occupations, Kashmir and Palestine. It's obviously a hot button issue at the moment, Azad, because of the genocide clock that is ticking in India, and the personality of Modi, blood on his hands from the time of the Gujarat massacre, his own personal history as a member of the RSS. So many people have focused on this particular story, but when you wrote this book, how deep did you dig? Because many people might have the conception that this alliance only arose because of Modi and the BJP.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I feel as if your listeners get one thing out of this discussion, is that we need to move away from the idea that India was some kind of thriving secular democracy in which Muslims could do whatever they want, and it had a good quality of life, and they were free to practice, and they were free to be politically active as well, and free to express their Muslim identity. Because that's not a full story of India, and this relationship, to me, in many ways, explains India a lot. So what I mean by that is, when we think about India, the India-Israeli relationship, people think that it started with Modi, but Modi is only at the top of an entire structure that was created for him, meaning that you can't just, accelerate a relationship to such a degree that the state, all elements of the state, is happy to increase their arms purchases by 175%, right? Within 4 years, that's between 2015 and 2019. Obviously, there has to be a superstructure in place in which everyone's on board, right? Modi is only one person, and so we have to understand that, just as the Muslims have had a very difficult time. And of course, they were able to practice a lot more in India prior to Modi coming on. But it wasn't like some sort of easy time to be a Muslim. If you were Dalit or you're Muslim under Congress from 47, you were most likely to be at the bottom rung of society. Right? It's very hard for you to move up. The Muslims are living in ghettos, right? And they're forced, and the government has refused for decades to allow them to build their houses or to fix their homes, to give them permits to improve their lives, right? And that's very similar to Palestine as well, how what they do to the Palestinians, and then later they break down their homes and say they're illegal, right? So what I mean by this is that India has always been difficult for minorities, right? For Indian Muslims and Dalits and Christians and all of that. However, they've been able to present themselves as a kind of country that cares about these issues, when they really haven't, right? And so it's the same with India and Israel, in which they've presented themselves as being hostile publicly to Israel and being very pro-Palestine. But if you look at the history books, actually not even the history books, you look at the documents, because there aren't that many texts written on this issue, which is part of the difficulty of writing the book, was that we had to, I had to essentially dig into primary sources and look at the original documents, or the agreements or discussions in the archives. Essentially, you find that India had actually, not a developed relationship with Israel, but secret ties in which they were buying arms, they were exchanging intel, they were, trying. They had a relationship with Palestine that was in their interest to seem that they were anti-Israel at the time. And so when it was not in their interest anymore to be pro-Palestine, then the relationship moved up a gear into which they could become closer to Israel. So there's a long history of these guys being not close with each other, but having a relationship, but also pretending that they didn't have a relationship. And then also that pretense of not having a relationship was also built on a moral ground. So anyone can shoot back and say, oh, but all countries have secret relations. The UAE has secret relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia has secret relations with Israel. Yeah, but no one believes that Saudi or UAE has some kind of moral compass in this way, right? Mm-hmm. But in India, you had Gandhi and you had Nehru and being part of an online movement and being anti-colonial, and you feel as if like they were anti-apartheid. So obviously they must be a good country, But actually they're just like any other country. And people need to people need to come to terms with that, essentially.
I really like how you put it on page 58 of the book, discussing what you've just mentioned, where you call it a dehyphenated approach to Israel and Palestine would play out in Indian relations, where political and economic pragmatism with Israel would be occurring on the one hand, and charity, basically handouts for the compromised Palestinian leadership, would be occurring on the other hand. But having said that, and in your book you would note how the likes of Nehru, the likes of Gandhi, the likes of the poet Tagore, and many others were complicit and showed the admiration at various stages for the Israeli leadership. It obviously took a major or dramatic turn when the BJP came to office. I just want to zoom in on that picture of the personal dynamics. If one is to see the way that shake hands and the way that embrace themselves, Modi and Netanyahu, do you think the personal dynamics of that relationship also speak to a very increased level of warmth?
The personal dynamic is pretty much the cherry on the top, in a way, in which you have both countries have come to, Israel, when it was created, right? It was a Zionist project which was built to take over a piece of land, right, and remove the people from that land, and this place was called Israel. But that ideology, or that state that was built through that ideology, rather, as Edward Said puts it, there was an attempt to conceal Zionism. It's to try and create this idea of Israel just being a normal country, right? And so they concealed it. They concealed the idea that they're an ethnic cleansing, genocidal kind of state, right? They tried to conceal that idea, even though it was born by that. So India concealed those ideals and those ideas as well tremendously. So even someone like Gandhi, who's like not very great on caste and actually has some racist bones in his body, they were able to conceal those elements too and just project his salt marches and his anti-colonial ideas from early on, which were very flawed, right? Now, this is to say that both countries then move over the several decades, and they both have these two leaders now who endorse the extent of those ideologies. They are not ashamed of the ideologies, right? Where you have someone like Manmohan Singh, who buys billions of dollars worth of arms from Israel, is kind of ashamed that he has to do that, publicly. He doesn't want to be seen. Not going to shake hands with the Israeli Prime Minister, not visit Israel. But Netanyahu and Modi, they bond for each other. And this also then results in an exaggeration of their role in creating the relationship. But yes, their personal chemistry has most certainly allowed this relationship to blossom even further. And what we mean by that is they see in each other kind of the strength that they want to demonstrate for their countries, right? So Modi looks at Netanyahu and he wants to be like Netanyahu, right? And Netanyahu looks at Modi and he sees a strong leader who's adding religious nationalism to his portfolio and to his persona, and who's leading a so-called large democratic country, and he wants to be associated with Modi because it gives him credibility as well. He's like, look at me, I'm Netanyahu, and you guys don't respect me so much, but I have the world's biggest democracy, in my pocket and at my side. So Modi comes to power, and he totally endorses Netanyahu, and they meet in Haifa in 2017 when Modi becomes the first prime minister to travel to India. They meet in Haifa, and they go into the beach, and they pick up their pants above their ankles, and they walk through the shore and into the water, and they kind of talk to each other as friends. And as I've said previously, this is not a kind of image you would associate with two leaders of two big countries, right, or two important countries, so-called. Normally, you would see them in a boardroom, but here it is that they're basically trying to project this idea that two long-lost brothers or friends are being rekindled. They're meeting after a long time, and now finally this relationship is going to blossom. So that chemistry most certainly has allowed this relationship to blow up, and it's also created the impetus for the media to also deflect from the past, as well as to hide the fact that this relationship is actually very dangerous, because they call it a bromance and they call it all of those things, right? And so it's like whitewashes the relationship.
As far as the arms sales, one would understand, and there would be a plethora of figures that would illustrate this, how, India is one of the major customers of Israeli arms, and how that has, just expanded over the years. But I want you to touch on another element that you mention in the book, which is how Israeli weapons are now being manufactured in India. Explain to us how that works and how this can now obscure the source of arms when India sells these arms to other countries.
Yeah, so this is the way you frame it. The obscurity is really the point here, in that India purchases around 46% of all Israeli arms that are exported. At some point in time, there was an Indian analyst, it was almost like a decade ago. He said that India probably buys more arms from Israel than the Israeli military buys from Israeli companies, right? And, that's an extraordinary kind of thing to say, right? And that means that India is purchasing a ton of arms, but India is not just purchasing them, as you say, they are now co-manufacturing. So Israel is sending the technology and the know-how to India, and private companies are getting the technology, and now they're replicating it, and then with the Israeli assistance, they have these factories that are all over India, and they're now building drones, they're building machine guns, they're building sniper rifles, building sensors, and these essentially will be exported to countries that are friendly to India. and perhaps these are countries that are not necessarily friendly to Israel, but they'll be friendly to India, and so you can easily now market them as an Indian item, right? But you also would say an Indian item with sort of like Israeli technology on it, but it's an Indian item, right? And so if you are slightly amenable to that kind of product, you're going to take it. And of course we know people are buying Israeli weapons anyway, but this is now creating another avenue for sales. And when you buy an Israeli weapon, you're not just buying an actual weapon, you're buying a technology, you're buying a methodology. So you are saying, here's the weapon, and here's how we used it. And here's the result of how we used it. Here's a video, essentially. And so when they take that, when these interested parties buy these weapons, they're going to replicate what Israel did to Palestinians, because that's where it was learned on, that's where it was practiced on. And that's why they call Palestine a laboratory for Israeli weapons. So yeah, that's very, very dangerous. So we're not talking just about Israeli weapons being pushed through to different markets, but we're also talking about a methodology being exported.
We're into the final stretch of our interview today with Azad Essa, talking about his new book, Hostile Homelands, the new alliance between India and Israel, to shift focus to the Abraham Accords, the normalization deals that occurred with the United States, Israel, the UAE and Bahrain. What was very fascinating in the book was an Indian role or parallel agreement with India involving the UAE and the United States of America, something called I2U2. And it wasn't just a kind of trade agreement, but it kind of directly involves India in the affairs of Palestine, or rather not India, but the UAE in the affairs of Palestine. So what can you tell us more about the role of the UAE in this alliance, essentially between Israel and India?
So, the relationship between India and Israel has always been a complicated one, in that, as I said earlier, they projected themselves in a particular way, being hostile. But as part of that projection or that foreign policy was a kind of a fear factor or conservatism from the Indian government and Indian foreign policy establishment, that if they become too close with Israel, right, they might lose the Arab world's support for them. Now, when we think about the Abraham Accords, right, Trump comes in and he pushes through these accords, and it creates this language of economic peace, right, because that's what it's essentially about, right, this fake economic peace. And it blackmails Morocco, it blackmails Sudan to join as well. Now, India realizes during the period that it no longer has to. You already have Netanyahu and Modi, right, who are close with each other and unashamed about the relationship. But now the UAE has also, and so have other nations in the Gulf and other Arab countries, barring Saudi Arabia, although they are part of the drama, in that they have created an additional reason for India to become closer to Israel, because there's no backlash that's going to come from the Arab world, imagined or not. So if India becomes extremely close to Israel, the UAE has no legs to stand on to say, why are you doing that? We're going to cut off any kind of oil deals or whatever. So the UAE is actually central to that relationship, but it's also central to India's relationship with the Gulf. And India has a lot of Indians, a lot of people working, a lot of diaspora rather, working in the Gulf, and it's a huge source of income for them. And so, as part of that relationship is also geared towards, creating a kind of ecosystem in which a very particular type of Muslim polity is created, in which a Muslim who would be just interested in maybe praying and identifying himself as Muslim, but nothing more than that. You don't have any kind of political agenda, any kind of political thought. You can't have any this kind of dissent, and that's the kind of Muslim India wants to create. And it can say it's not Islamophobic by being close to a Muslim majority country, but it's actually an authoritarian country in which those Muslims living there have no rights. Those diaspora communities, especially the laborers, have no rights. Right? So it's a perfect ploy in which these two countries work together. They create these security states, and the people on both sides have no rights. Now, an added dimension to that is this I2U2 thing, in which India, Israel, the UAE, and the United States have come together to create this West Asia bloc. And part of the reason is to help Israel integrate itself into the Middle East. Israel has been cut off from the larger Middle East. Israel did it on its own, plus the Middle East also boycotted Israel for the longest time. But now you have the Abraham Accords, and now India is the facilitator of that integration. And the second part of it is trying to kind of stymie China's rise in the Middle East as well. So you have this Belt and Road project that's coming from to the Silk Road, etc., from China through Central Asia, and the U.S. wants to kind of counter that. So they've created this West Asia bloc in which now India helps them counter that aspect. Now, one of the first products or the first fruits of this relationship is the Haifa port, in which India now purchases the Haifa port, or Indian company purchases the Haifa port, and it means that Haifa port now would become a kind of hub for that I2U2 construct, in which now if goods are coming from the east and they want to get to the west, they don't need to go through Egypt, for instance. They can just go to Saudi or to the UAE, go onto a railway track and go all the way to Haifa, and then from Haifa go to Europe and go to like North America. Now that's a really, really big deal, because then Haifa becomes a kind of Dubai in the Eastern Mediterranean. It becomes a kind of a free market capitalist sort of like entity in which nothing can stop it, because you have all of these entities that are now invested in it. You have the UAE, you have the Indians, you have the US. So if there's a third or fourth intifada in Palestine, that's not going to dismantle it, because who do you blame for that port now? Who do you blame? It's like everyone's involved.
Something I found quite interesting, maybe coming very close to comical as well, in my opinion, was this construct of Hindu phobia. Now, I would appreciate that people from all backgrounds do face prejudice, and that's quite real, but it was almost a construct that was elevated to the level of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, with not much to show, not much evidence to show for that. And this is the product of the Hindutva lobby in the United States. So talk to us about the Hindutva lobby in the United States. We know about the gun lobby, we know about the Israeli lobby. How much was the Israel lobby and the tactics of the Israeli lobby responsible for creating the Hindutva lobby, and how effective or how intimidating is the Hindutva lobby in its practices?
So the Hindutva lobby was created on its own. The Israeli lobby did not create the Hindutva lobby. However, the Israeli lobby essentially in many ways trained the Hindutva lobby and facilitated their introduction into the U.S. political scene. So that means helping them like create political candidates, helping them raise money, because everything in the U.S. when it comes to politics is all about the money. Helping them create internships for Indian Americans in Congress. And all of these matters comes to everything that has come since. Whatever you see in India when it comes to a pro-Hindutva or pro-Modi agenda, that has come most likely, from some, Israeli consultant, right, or pro-Israel consultant, and this is not some conspiracy. They have admitted this on their own. They talk about, there's a group that spoke to Jewish Currents, a magazine in the U.S. It spoke about how they modeled this, Hindu phobia on anti-Semitism, right? And they tried to extrapolate the lessons from from the pro-Zionist lobby, pro-Israel lobby, and to ensure that they are able to pick out criticism when needed. And it was actually the Anti-Defamation League, right, that presents itself as a kind of civil rights organization that helped the Hindutva lobby in the U.S. Even create the impetus for the FBI to label Hinduphobia as an actual separate category on the FBI hate crimes list. And if you look at the list, Hinduphobia is very low down on the list. So it's nowhere near the kinds of crimes committed towards Muslims and towards Jews in the U.S. But yeah, Israel for the longest time has wanted India and Delhi to be on its side. And so when it found the opportunity to get them onto their side, they used every trick in the book as well to essentially work with the Hindu nationalist lobby and to ensure that they use a similar kind of talking points to get them that kind of audience with the U.S. government. And that has included also like tackling curriculums, trying to adjust a very simple thing, like they want South Asia to be labeled India, right? The whole of South Asia should be labeled India because that's the Hindu nationalist agenda. And so they've been trying all of these tactics. They've also, you're asking about how intimidating they are. They're extremely intimidating. If you say anything against Zionism, you are put on some kind of list online. Hindutva does the same. And they're extremely crass, extremely vile, and extremely, unrelenting. So they will troll you. And if you're a woman, it becomes extremely disturbing, the kinds of things that they say. In so much so that there was a piece also written on Huffington Post recently, or HuffPost. It said that one congressional aide told HuffPost that sometimes it seems that it's harder to organize on India and Modi than it is on Palestine. And Palestine is hard enough. But you kind of get the sense that there's so many blockages. And part of it is because the Hindu nationalist lobby understand that India is so crucial for the U.S. project at this point because of China. So they are able to, they are paying and they're lobbying, but they also know that it's easy for them. It's not like India is an adversary to the U.S. It's a completely on board its project. So they get away with it.
I'll come to talk about the activism in my last question. Just one more point before that, and that is, I think it would be very easy for a discerning listener to be able to connect the dots between all these levels of relationship to the oppression that is playing itself out in Kashmir, as well as the wider Muslims in India. But just to illustrate it for us, how would you be able to provide an example of a lynching or a crime that is carried out in Kashmir or against Muslims or other marginalized groups in India that shows a direct link then to the Israeli role in that?
Sure. There are several examples. The one is you could think about Pegasus software. The Indian government, when bought Pegasus software from Israel, and they used the software to target activists in India, not just activists, but even politicians. Rahul Gandhi, the main opposition leader, was also targeted by that. So that's the Israeli method as well, where it's in 100% using surveillance to kind of intimidate and harass, and also even infiltrate, so that you can get some information, or you can entrap or use the information to jail someone, and that has happened. When you think about what's happening in the West Bank at the moment, in which you have these settlers that are going around pillaging through villages and towns in the occupied West Bank, you can directly relate it to how Muslim neighborhoods in India are being targeted by Hindu nationalist mobs that go in and also rampage, go into mosques and intimidate. They start singing songs, and the police, just as the Israeli forces just stand by and do nothing, the Indian police stand by and watch and do nothing. So it's a kind of a very clear kind of intimidatory sort of tactics. Going back to Kashmir as well, you can think about this idea of claiming that this particular land suddenly belongs to the state, and you now have a house or you have a shop on state land, so we're going to demolish it. So without actually getting any kind of judicial sort of advancement, any kind of permission, you get the notice and you use a bulldozer and you demolish the homes. I mean, these are very similar kinds of things, and it's also important to know that some of these tactics, have existed before. They're not just suddenly started, but you see a symmetry increasing. Part of the part of the project in Kashmir also is to change the population demographics. So you are bringing in, just as settlers are going into the West Bank and they're trying to change the demography in the West Bank, in which it becomes irreversible. You change the facts on the ground. They're now trying to flood Kashmir with Indians. And then you create a situation, these are settlers who will live in like settler colonies. And you create a difference between the Kashmiri indigenous, like native person, and the outsider who's living there. And suddenly at some point, you kind of have a situation where the settler might actually, the settler population might be more than the native population. Then you sort of change the whole dynamics. There are several examples.
Exactly, and you just mentioning the settlers in Kashmir, there's also the parallel, I think, that you mentioned of the wall and the fence that's quite similar to the apartheid wall in occupied Palestine. I just want to leave it off with coming to South Africa. You are South African, and the relevance of the content of this book to two groups of people, the wider South Africa, and particularly to the audience also we connecting with today, the Muslim community in South Africa.
Yeah, I would hope, and I believe that the book has relevance, not just the cover that has the old South African flag on it, to remind everyone that apartheid is not dead. And apartheid here is not dead also. We are still living in an environment in which economic apartheid is in many ways expanding, and people need to, really consider and be more in touch with the kind of inequities that are existing, right? And there's definitely going to be some type of explosion in this country at some point, considering our unemployment rate and considering the immense income inequality that exists here, right? So we can't be blind to that. The second thing that's really important is that if we're going to think about Palestine and we're going to talk about Palestine, we've got to also understand what and who are the other factors or the other players in the story. India is now part of the Israeli occupation of Palestinians. If you are going to rise up on Palestine just because of Aqsa, for instance, right, and you're not going to think about India, then you're not actually rising up for Aqsa, right? You are just being very, very narrow-minded in terms of your kind of your outrage, because India is also doing similar things in which they are demolishing mosques, and the Babri Masjid was destroyed in the early 90s, and even though the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to do so, they have now allowed these Hindu nationalists to now build a temple in that place. And that shows the kind of judiciary that exists in India. And so there will be a stage in which Indian Muslims won't be able to practice even. We're coming to that stage now. And why wait that long, right? Already in Kashmir, for several dozens of weeks, the main mosque in Kashmir has not been open for people to pray in, right? And people aren't able to practice properly. They aren't able to even mobilize, aren't able to meet freely. If a couple of people meet together in a restaurant, they'll come and come and check up on you and maybe even arrest you, right? So what I'm saying to you is that South Africans, if they want to talk about Palestine, they've got to understand that India is part of the equation, and they've got to start grappling with, especially if you're Indian, you've got to start, of Indian origin rather, you've got to start grappling with the fact that India is part of the problem. And it's also relevant because South Africa is going to be hosting this BRICS soon. And I think a lot of pressure needs to be placed on the South African government to not have a hypocritical sort of stance on all of these issues. They can't just be talking about Palestine and not be focusing on their partner that's actually assisting the occupation. Right? And I think once people start moving away from the silos and start talking about things as a collective, then you create the impetus or the pressure for politicians to be forced to say something or to do something.
Azad, thank you so much for thought-provoking discussion today, and as well as the thought-provoking contribution through this book, which is basically a valuable dossier of information, of historical records for people to understand what underpins this particular alliance. The availability of the book in South Africa?
Yeah, so the book was published in the UK and the US, and there's like a limited print that has been made available in South Africa. It's available at Exclusives. It's available at several independent bookstores in Joburg. We have an event tomorrow as well at Book Circle Capital in Melville. And I would love to see sort of like young people come to this event and raise their sort of concerns, or they ask questions about what they can do. And I'm not going to have all the answers, but it's important that these conversations are taking place. And yeah, so I mean, the book is available, and there's no dearth of information about this issue. And I'm looking forward to talking more about it.
Azad Essa is an award-winning journalist and author. He's currently a senior reporter for the Middle East Eye and has written for Al Jazeera, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and The Guardian. Talking to us today here at Radio Islam International about Hostile Homelands, his new book that puts India's relationship with Israel in its historical context and looks at the origins and similarities between Zionism and Hindutva. Thank you so much, Shukran, for your time, and wishing you the best for the remainder of your launches. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.